Welcome to the Living Life Juicy podcast, where we explore how we can be present and kind as we go about doing great things. Some other channels or options that we have. There's a Growing People channel, which is where I post resources that you might find useful in your organization, and really is to provide insights on how people and groups develop. And then there's the Into Wisdom group, intowisdomgroup.com, which is the website where we talk about services and experiences and resources where we guide people and groups to their next best step towards growth and sustainability. Last little piece here, I'm proud to say that The Pottery Panda is my latest book. It's going to be released on April 21st. And you can actually get it, pre-order a copy by going to potterypanda.com. So we're going to jump in here. Today, our guest is Bryn Lottig. I first met Bryn at an AEE conference on the vendor floor. It was like 6 years ago, I think. It was just after she launched a big project that she's on. She's still doing amazing things. And I just thought it'd be wonderful to catch up with her, find out what she's up to, and just explore how she's living life juicy. So, Bryn, welcome. Glad you're here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Very nice to be here, John.
Yeah.
And congrats on your book. I haven't been able to tell you. I've been watching all the chatter, and it's super exciting.
Yeah. And if you've published before, you know, this last little bit is harrowing.
It's very flattering to think that I have. No, I have not been a part of that process.
Man, it's but it's like, that's what I'm doing, spending my most of my time. We just sent it off to the printer, and we should get our galley copy. I think that's what it's called, so that we can check it before it goes to full print. But the way that we've set it up is that it's what I call the simple book concept. So at the end of every chapter, there's a QR code that takes you to a list of resources, and then you click on those, and it takes you to another list of resources with other articles and videos. Ultimately, you can actually get down to an interactive PDF workbook so that you can do your own planning. But the fun part is that it's a story about a raccoon. So it's called The Pottery Panda. But if you live anywhere with raccoons, you know that they are more formally known as trash pandas. So,
yes, sir.
So I want to give you the chance to explain what you do. That's why I give such a short intro. And I want to hear, first of all, let's start with this. How does your husband describe what you do?
I think he's pretty good at parroting my own phrases. But he will say that my very favorite thing to do is all the things. And I like to play with kids in the woods.
Okay. Is that how you describe what you do?
Most of the time. That's how I describe my favorite things. But I am a chronic like FOMO kind of person. So way before YOLO was even a phrase, I wanted to do all of the things. And so my bio is pretty extensive, and the hats that I wear can be both physical and metaphoric, in that there's a lot of them. So what I do, I guess I started my career, I was going to be a private pilot. I was flying airplanes when I was very young, and that was.
Did you come with? Are there pilots in your family, or?
No.
Okay, it's just something that popped into your head. I want to fly.
Yeah. So I started flying airplanes in high school, and then in college, was going to school to be a professional pilot. 9/11 happened, that tanked, and I went abroad and found. I went on my very first Apostle Islands kayaking trip, and I found wilderness travel, and then I traveled abroad and backpacked through like 9 different countries, and fell in love with this whole idea of expeditionary travel. So after college was guiding trips, and when I met my husband and moved up north, I found Camp Manitowish, which is a YMCA camp here in the Northwoods, and learned about challenge courses, and using the challenge course to sort of focus the same lessons that I had learned as an individual, but in a very intentional way and found that you could elicit some of the same learning objectives in a shorter amount of time, and started working with groups, and fell in love with that, but took a break to have some babies. And when I came back, I was like, yeah, I think I'd like to go to a conference or two, and instead went and got a master's. And then
Well, tell me this, before we jump
Yeah.
into that part of it, tell me
Yeah.
about, like, so you really put your foot in the water through kayaking. Is that where it
Oh, yeah.
started?
Yes. Yeah.
What
Kayaking.
about that experience? Do you think that, the kayaking piece?
So kayaking, I always feel like this mermaid centaur thing. I joke, people who prefer other disciplines of travel, that I'm too lazy to carry my stuff, so I don't like to backpack. And canoeing is just the worst of both, because you have to carry the heavy stuff and the paddling is less efficient. So getting out in the woods, I think that there's just something that levels the playing field when you're on a wilderness experience, that it doesn't matter who you are or what experiences you had prior. The ocean has, or I mean, not even the ocean, it was Lake Superior. Lake Superior just has a way of humbling you, and
That counts as open water, I think. That's thinking of. I actually used to teach quiet water paddling at a couple of different colleges. And it's so interesting when you're out there, and we would do, this is Southern California. It was with Cal State Northridge, and then another university down here. And we would take this group of 15 or 20 college students out for a weekend paddle down the lower Colorado. And they freaked out when I told them to take off their watches. And it's like, well, how will we know when to eat lunch? So we eat when we're hungry. Where are we going to stop? Well, whenever we get hungry. And it was just that lack of, they felt like they were out of control because they weren't on a schedule and they weren't tracking time, and it was magical.
Yeah. And I can say a couple of things about that. In that, one, time is a social construct, and two, we become dysregulated when things are not predictable. And I think the thing that I am learning now, having been in this industry for 20 years plus, that we're almost doing a disservice to some of our participants, and it becomes a power dynamic when we have the schedule and we withhold it from them. And it creates more anxiety because they're trying to take control of what they have control of. And so sometimes, I grew up at a camp, and our answer was like, what time is it? Time to get a watch. What are we doing next? It's a mystery, that whole thing. But I'm learning more the profile of the youth that I work with. That's not helpful. That does not build trust.
Right.
And I think that there's a bit of a shift. However, I do love the circadian rhythms of taking away that, because you go to bed when it gets dark, and you wake up when it gets light, and you eat when you're hungry, and you listen to your body. And I think that there's a lot of people who don't know how to listen to their bodies anymore.
Well, and then when you're in the backcountry, that's where that works really well.
Yeah.
But when you're at a camp, and they know that you're manipulating time, that becomes an issue. I remember we used to do a camp out on Catalina Island with you. And because we wanted to have better daylight, stuff like that, we would create our own Catalina time, and we would shift everything one way or the other by an hour. And that was, we set all the clocks that way, and it just worked programmatically. But my biggest pushback on a lot of camp and even conference programs is that they're over-programmed.
Oh,
and they create no space. There's that phrase, we don't learn from experience, we learn from reflection on experience.
I feel like I say it daily.
It's what?
I said, I feel like I say that daily.
Right. And the thing is, first of all, nobody can identify where that quote actually comes from. We always attribute it, but you can't find it where he wrote it anywhere.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I've tried. But the idea is that we don't create these open spaces because we feel it's a waste of time. when
Mhm.
really that's when it makes all the difference in the world.
Mhm.
And I was having this conversation the other day with somebody who did we were talking about camps, and I said the most important time isn't when you're in the program or you're doing the stuff. We would take advantage of the bus rides or the walk to, all that kind of stuff, and we had to train our staff to understand the value of those moments.
Mhm. Yeah. So I guess going back to your answer earlier, currently my email signature is that I'm the co-founder of an ed tech app called Kikori, but I am also the leadership center director at Camp Manitowish in northern Wisconsin. And so straddling both of these realms in ed tech and then camp, but working primarily with school groups. I'm either trying to sell in school to schools to get more experiential ed into their classrooms, or I'm trying to get them to bring their kids to me so that I can play with them in the woods. And they want us to program for them. And I see it both like when they bring their kids to camp, or when I talk about what they should be doing in the classroom, is they are terrified of unstructured time because they think they will lose control, and they don't know how to wrap it back up. And I think that we need to transform teachers into educational facilitators. And I think that unstructured time is like the most important time, but I also have to get people to pay me for things. And if that's not what they want, I can't continue to sell it.
Well, in first of all,
yeah.
I'm going to be in a couple of weeks. I'm going to be talking with Lucinda Martinelli, who has that same vision
Yeah.
For transforming teachers into facilitators. And I think the term unstructured time is inaccurate.
Yes.
It's a matter of teaching students and kids at very young age how to use that unprogrammed time.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can be very intentional with it. I remember I was at a camp and the kids were staying in teepees, and everything was outside and all that kind of stuff. And we would have them in the mornings. It's a 5-day camp. The first
Mm-hmm.
morning we would give them 10 minutes, but the first 8 was structured.
Mm.
Then the next day we'd give them 5 and 5. And the next day we'd give them, 3 and 7. And the next day we'd give them 1 and 9. And by the end of the week, they understood how to use that time when we weren't talking at them, and they used it productively.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just wrapped up a program with 6 middle school girls. They came up during their spring break, and my staff were really struggling to get them to stay involved in some of our more complex problem solving initiatives. And so my staff were feeling frustrated and the kids were feeling frustrated. And I was like, look, there's a difference between team building and team bonding. And what is the goal of the outcome or of this program? And it's just to provide a safe space for them during their spring break, when there isn't a school for them to go to hang out up here and be together. So I was like, everybody needs to relax. And your worth as a facilitator is not whether or not you can get them to solve hard puzzles. It's whether or not you can get them to connect with one another. And maybe that's by playing sardines. Maybe
okay,
playing dodgeball.
So when I do facilitator training, one of the first things I ask is, what are you facilitating? Facilitate means to make easy.
Yeah.
And I think too many experiential facilitators are, how can I make this as hard as possible, thinking of the activity. And so if, like for me, I facilitate growth, that's what I facilitate. I design experiences. But there's other people who might facilitate innovation, might facilitate learning, might facilitate connection. And that's the starting point. And too often we forget that you begin with the end in mind. If ultimately this is about connection, you can't get more connected than sardines.
Right? That's what I was saying. So, yeah.
Go ahead.
Changing that mindset just changes the tone for the whole program, and then nobody's in opposition to one another anymore. And I think that that's something that, I don't know, needs to be done more often, maybe in all of education, is that the goals and outcomes should be aligned with the participants as well as those who are leading.
Yeah, that was the big discovery for me, because we were talking earlier about how before the pandemic even happened, I was on Zoom and other platforms. You were too.
Mhm.
I think especially in the experiential world, people, March of 2020, they thought their world had ended. And I
Yeah.
started like just doing these things. Hey, let's take a look at what's possible. And
Hmm.
then they were overwhelmed with this despair. And then they were overwhelmed with possibilities. And that didn't help because they saw what it could do, but you've got to get in there and actually, experientially, you got to do it. And I had
Hmm.
some like world-class facilitators who I spoke with, whether in a workshop or just on our own, that were in despair because they didn't think they could do what they did.
Yeah.
And they you don't have to like virtual, but they realized through trying it that they could. And the biggest discovery was, oh yeah, let's start with outcomes. What do you want to accomplish with this group? And then we look at what's in usually you go back to the storage locker or whatever props you
Mhm.
have. Well, you look at your platform and you ask, all right, this is what we want to get to. What can we use here?
Yep.
And that light bulb reminded a lot of just expert facilitators to go back to the roots, back to the basics, and remember kind of how this stuff works, not just what you do on a regular basis, but how it works.
Hmm. For sure.
Tell me this. I want to talk about transitions, and I want to hear about maybe some of your most challenging transitions. I know, so you and I both have had several previous lives, even simultaneous previous lives. I can go through
Yeah.
a list of one of my favorite things to do is talk about the different things that I've been bit by. But I want to hear because it sounds like you've had several significant transitions.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me about the most challenging one, and then how did you navigate that transition?
Mm. Well, the most challenging and the most recent, I guess I can really think of two. Having kids. But
Isn't that just so easy?
yeah. But I think that it was, but I wanted that. Like I was working towards that. I think an unexpected, unwanted transition for me was in January of 2020, I tore my ACL. And so at that point, I was a competitive dragon boater. My dragon boat team had qualified at a national level, and we were scheduled to compete in France the following summer. I was training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and was a 2-stripe blue belt under Royce Gracie, who won UFC 1 and UFC 2. And I was doing stuff with Kikori, and I was teaching at a public school. I was Adventure Bryn. And when I broke my leg, it was very jarring. Pretty extroverted person, had to go non-weight bearing and go in for surgery. And they not only repaired my ACL, but they removed part of my meniscus and then repaired part of the other. And with that meniscal repair, I had to stay non-weight bearing for 8 weeks. And so I was 4 weeks into my recovery when lockdown happened. And so I felt like I was halfway through, I was going to recover. And I was like, my PT I was gonna come back stronger. My bad leg was gonna become my good leg, and I was gonna crush it in France and all these other things. But the pandemic, it took my social life, it took my job, it took my physical therapy. And I was miserable. My kids were in my space all the time. I was on Zoom all the time. My husband was next to me on Zoom. My husband was screaming in his Zoom meetings. We had nowhere to go, and I couldn't even like go for walks.
So I'm curious about, like, I know the
Yeah.
physical transition piece of that. Talk a
Yeah.
little bit more about how that impacted your identity.
Oh, it was awful. Yeah, because I identified as an athlete. I identified as somebody who like, I could walk into my favorite coffee shop and they would notice if I had like straightened my hair. And I was going to the gym with people that I didn't even know their last name, but we would gossip on, you know, the spin bikes next to each other. And so I lost my identity as an educator because I couldn't be with my kids. I lost all that identity I had as an athlete and a social person. And it was very, very hard. And I also, it challenged my identity as an educator, even because I was like, oh, well, I'll teach my own kids.
Yeah.
It didn't go as well as I thought in my head. And
Yes.
so, yeah, it was pretty crippling. And one of the most successful ways that I dealt with it was that I found a group of women, and we started cold plunging. And so it's a multi-generational group. And at first I was like, this is the most ridiculous and stupid thing I've ever seen. I'm never going to do it. But I love that adventure part of it. And I was like, I'll come watch. And the first time I was like, you know what, maybe it'll be good for my knee. And I like soaked my knee. And it was on January 1st of 2021. And I got hooked and I kept going. And so it was a COVID friendly activity. We were outside, we were 6 feet apart. I got to see people face to face. I wasn't doing the Zoom fatigue. So currently I don't even have on my self view, but I didn't know how to turn that off back then. And knowing what it does to our brains, how damaging it is to like look at ourselves all the time and that Zoom fatigue. But I was with people in person outside doing something adventurous that felt good. It helped my knee swelling, and it had a really small footprint on my day. I didn't have to carve out 3 hours to go for like a 5-mile hike. I mean, we were in and out of the water in like a minute or two.
Which is smart.
Yeah. And that was really the turning point of that like knee transition. And so
how do you think that, I mean, why did that work for you? I mean, you listed a bunch of the things about, you know, the COVID stuff like that, but go a little bit more. What were the benefits of the cold plunge?
For me, it was another social activity. So I'm really social. I joke all the time about how Dr. Gary Chapman identified 5 love languages, but I also have an adventure love language where I have to feel like I've gone out and I've done something interesting, and it helped fill that bucket as well. And then there's just biological responses. There's a dopamine dump. There's these tingles that you get. And it's really good for inflammation. I was sleeping better. It was great. So
I'm curious about when you mentioned the adventure love language.
mm-hmm.
Do you think that is what drives part of your entrepreneurial spirit? And with Kikori and Kikori, is that part of what draws you towards that?
Oh yeah, that. And so Kikori was the brainchild of my co-founder. And we had talked about it when we were in grad school together, and we did a backpacking trip, and we shared a tent for 2 weeks out in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming, and she kept talking about it. And at the end of our grad program, I was just like, you know what, that's a really good idea, and I don't want to be left out. Like, I want to be a part of that. Like, this is going to be a thing, and I want to be a part of it. And she was like, okay. So yeah, it's definitely. But I had never envisioned myself as an entrepreneur prior to that.
Well, isn't it just like entrepreneurs? It's basically you're on a expedition, and
oh yeah,
you know,
we call it entrepreventure, and we say it's a meta team building initiative all the time.
So yeah, that's informed. So my background in outdoor stuff, and that's one of my former lives is I would either lead expeditions and outdoor programs for private schools and other people, or I would be the one organizing the expeditions and sometimes leading it too. And that's really impacted how I both do my thought partnering, advising, coaching, whatever you want to call it. But I talk about growth as a journey. And you'd be amazed at how, like, well, maybe not, but so much of that imagery goes into how I work with people. And it's this idea of, you would never just, you wouldn't plan an expedition with a group without doing planning. And you start with the end of, what do they want to accomplish? Not where do they want to go? But let's talk about the destination for this overall journey. Where do you want to end up? And then that launches the whole planning process. And I think that, so I do a lot of work now with small businesses and entrepreneurs who don't think that way. It's like, it's not until they'll launch their business, and they know their business, they know their stuff, they know their product, but they hit walls along the way that they don't, because they didn't anticipate, they didn't plan it like an expedition.
Sure. And I think my jam is the interpersonal dynamics. And when I approach people and I'm like, oh, it's okay, like, natural tension is supposed to be there. Like, you need somebody with that perspective in order to be a highly successful, highly functioning team. And we get into interaction styles and dynamics and perspectives and all of these things. And I was like, tension, it's okay. Like, if you didn't have that person, think of all the stuff that you would be missing on your own. You need them to complement you. You need them to round out your team. And talking about, like, taking those steps towards the middle, because otherwise you're going to just keep polarizing each other. And I always envision like a balance log when I'm talking to people about that. It's like, okay, if you're polarizing them and they're polarizing you, you guys are just going to move farther and farther back, and it's going to take more and more to balance it instead of moving towards one another.
So Adam Grant talks about, Adam Grant he's a professor and all this stuff, but he talks about personal confrontation or disagreement and process or content, and that groups that have really strong personal disagreement, those are ones that explode. And the ones that know how to disagree on content or process, that's healthy. And so I talk about what I call it is a positive dynamic tension. So I think of it as bull ring.
Yeah.
And if the tension is static, if you're talking about balance means that nothing's moving. So it's got to be positive dynamic tension, which means if you want to move a bull ring, somebody has to give and somebody has to pull. And if it's a larger group, then it's multiple of those things. But that's how you get movement, is by working the tension, not avoiding it.
Yeah. I love it.
So what do you think, like, right now on your entrepreneur venture, whatever, whatever it is, what is like the thing that's energizing you guys right now?
The entrepreventure. Because and we flipped it once too. Adventurepreneurs. The thing that's really exciting is that I feel like, we are trying to reroute an aircraft carrier thinking about the public education system, but that people are opening up to the idea of social emotional learning and mental health as not being so soft and not being a fluffy add-on. It's becoming essential. So the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning, or CASEL, has social emotional learning skills are mandated in 29 states, and that's only growing. The mental health needs of our students is becoming more and more apparent and is at the forefront. We've been saying connection before content for ages, but I feel like the greater population is finally starting to buy in on that. And I think we're going to see a big paradigm shift. I don't think that school now will look anything like school in the next 10, 15 years.
Yeah. So back on your turning a battleship. So Buckminster Fuller was speaking, and somebody said, I just don't get it. It's how do you turn the Queen Mary? And he says, that's the wrong question,
Mm-hmm.
because you need to figure out, with the size of that ship, you need to figure out how to turn the rudder, because you can't just turn the rudder.
Mm-hmm.
And he went to explain that in order to turn the rudder, there's about a 10% part of that rudder that's called the trim tab. You actually
Okay.
throw that into the current and it slams the rudder, and that turns the boat. And
Hmm.
we talked about that with talking about organizational change or any
Yeah.
societal change. You need to get that buy-in from the trim tab.
Yeah.
And that creates the momentum to hit the rudder, which turns the ship. And it's
Mm-hmm.
basically a series of increasing influence on that
Mm-hmm.
part of it. So I always thought that was helpful for me when I would get frustrated looking at the changes that I'd like to make. And that's part of it. We were also on that same thing about, first of all, what soft skills, I don't think that works. And then, you talk about leadership skills. I actually don't think that works either, because you go to a leadership program, they say everybody's a leader. But if you've never been to one, everybody goes, oh, no, a leader is somebody who has reports. And if you look at what we teach, most, like I would say that there's some core things in a leadership program are usually building and maintaining a team, not team building, not just going out in the field and playing, but you have to assemble a team. You have to be able to develop those people, coaching, whatever. You need to have critical and quality thinking, and you need to have emotional and social intelligence. Well, tell me anybody in your organization that wouldn't benefit from those things. First time stepping in the door. So
Exactly.
I started referring those as professional skills. You have technical skills, and you can have technical skills about computer science or construction, or management technical skills, and you have professional skills, which everybody could benefit from. So I do believe that, actually, and this might be a little controversial, I think the thing that's holding emotional social learning back is calling it emotional social learning, because you immediately get 1,000% buy-in and you get 1,000% skeptic, and to try and develop people in that environment is really tough. But if you go out on the backside, this is what's great about experiential learning, is that you throw them out there and you talk about what made them successful, and guess what they're talking about? It's like when we taught emotional intelligence, the very first thing we did before we got into any of that, we said, tell me about your best boss and tell me about your worst boss.
Oh, sure.
And then they'd put them up on the board, and okay, done, do that. And all the things they put up there were either emotional social competencies, they were coaching competencies, they were quality thinking competencies. So they actually outlined the curriculum that they would go through, and we would point to it and say, doesn't matter what you call it, this is just what is being a good boss.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So how do you say that in like K-12 language, or maybe even K-8, because they're like, okay, well, we're not trying to make them professionals yet. We're just trying to educate them.
Well, do you think they latch on to emotional social learning? Is that in their vocabulary?
It is a little bit with some teachers. Yeah.
With teachers, but does it resonate with a kindergartner?
No.
Right, exactly. So what if we use behind the scenes, we can use all the fancy language that we want, the brain science and all that. But I think that's why my thing is, be present and kind as you do great things.
Yeah.
And you have to do a little explanation about what present is, but they're working on kindness all the time. And when you inspire them by, guess what? There's a sequence here. If you are truly listening and caring and being there for that person, you will know what kindness means. And then it's through those things that you will do great things. Great being not well known or famous or anything like that, but things that really move the world. And so that's to me is just like, you've got to speak the language of your audience.
Yes.
And I just hear so much of the people who especially the people who are deep into those competencies. When you work with them, they understand how to translate that language. The problem is that skill set isn't transferred down the line to the people who are actually leading these programs. So there's got to be training about, they know how to speak third grade. And because they haven't translated ESL stuff into third grader language,
Mhm.
it makes it really, to me, it just seems really like, okay, we're going to go, they're doing all their other stuff in that language and they're really good at it,
Yeah.
but they're just given this curriculum. This ESL is important. We got to do SL. So that's my take on it. I could be wrong.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I mean, experiential education has been around for ages, but it's never broken through into the public school system, despite the fact that we know that we make a difference and that we are effective. And so how do we bridge that? How do we get more experiential education into classrooms, and how do we get more kids out of their classrooms? How do we argue that value and make it less jargony to break down those barriers?
Well, and I think part of it, first of all, I think there's some areas of the country that are far more connected to experiential methodology than others.
Mm,
Like I think about where Project Adventure has made some inroads and is locked into it, usually in the physical ed world, but
mhm,
there's other places where teachers are translating it in there. And I actually think that there's some teaching methodologies that use what we would call experiential ed, but they call it something different. And
mm,
so we end up saying, you know what, you're playing the piano. No, you're playing the piano. No, you're playing the piano. And sometimes we're using the same words to talk about different things. Other times I'm speaking Chinese and you're speaking math. And yet
mhm,
we're getting to the same thing. And I think part of it is just sitting down. I guess I can be arrogant sometimes and come in and say, I know this stuff works. You need to do it. And they're coming at, yeah, but you are not in the classroom 100% of the time. When you were, that was years ago, you're out of it. We know what we're doing. And I think it needs to be dropping that pretension and saying, let's talk about how we can be better. I
mhm,
know I can learn from you. I think I've got some stuff where you can learn from me. Let's find out what we have in common and then march it forward. And this is why.
mhm.
So, okay, I love a connection before content, but I'm a big believer that content, if it's just content, send an email. It's a process that you enter into. So it's connection before process. And part of that
Mm,
process is content, but part of it is them doing things and reflecting on things and making, perceptions and synthesis and acting and all these things. It's a process you enter into. And we think we're done at the end with content.
mm,
And it's not. I mean, that's why single events don't work when it comes to learning or change. It
mm,
has to be a longer process that's over not just days, but weeks and months. And
mhm,
we need to view our programs as a piece of that overall process.
mhm,
And especially if you're coming in from outside, it's asking, all right, so what piece is this going to fit into? Otherwise, it's a great experience. They have a good time, but the lasting impact. We realize that at camps. I
oh
worked
yeah,
at a I worked at a church camp, and we viewed our program as a piece of their year-long process for the youth.
mhm,
And so we were really connected and had great conversations with all the leaders that would bring kids up, and they felt ownership over our programs because they
mhm.
impacted it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one of my biggest pet peeves working at camp was that we'd work with these school groups and the teachers would be like, "Oh my gosh, that was amazing. Oh, that's over," and go back to school. You
And
know,
even
and
if you'd hand them like, here, do these things in the next
yeah.
week and all that kind of stuff, I get it. Teachers are overwhelmed.
Mhm.
And in California, it's impossible for me to come in. First of all, teachers hate in services. And if
Yeah.
it's not directly related to their subject matter in their class, they buy out right away.
Mhm.
Um, but they're so overwhelmed with all they have to do. And then there's every other year, there's a new IT system they've got to work with. And then there's the latest, the latest and greatest educational theory and model that and every other year, then they're just going, okay, what can I use from this that actually is helpful? The rest is
Mhm.
gone. So that's, I guess, the biggest challenge is getting it into the teacher's mind that this is going to make your world easier in some way.
Yeah, and that's why Kendra and I developed the Kikori platform. And, when we first started, like our first version just had team building activities. And then we took those team building activities and we aligned them with, these standards that teachers recognized. So CASEL's SEL standards, along with 21st century skills, and then UNESCO's Sustainable Development Goals. And that in itself wasn't enough. And so we've created these calendars that have that follow a pattern that uses the same repeatable thing every single day. And so within the calendars, there's Kikori activities, but we also have customized morning meeting and advisory meeting schedules where we come up with a different team building activity or activity of the day for each of those designated times to help get their minds wrapped around how to think this way, how to think in an experiential format. So we are a crowdsourced platform, and there's a bunch of contributors that contribute content. But regardless of who contributes it, every single activity you can count on has step-by-step instructions for play, and then reflect, connect, grow questions that follow the experiential learning cycle. So again, yeah, we don't learn from our experience, we learn from reflecting on experience, and sometimes debriefing or wrapping that up is some of the most intimidating and scary parts for an educator. And so if we can structure it after that, what, so what, now what, we can have that intentional focused growth. And we use multi-intelligences. So sometimes we offer a debrief in a think, pair, share. Sometimes it's popcorn. Sometimes it's a journal prompt. But all these different multiple intelligences, but that really focuses on debriefing the experience and what do you want to change and what do you want to grow from this next?
Yeah, and I think you guys are striking a good balance, because sometimes it's so dumbed down that just to do these things, and there's no connection to the why or the how of it. And then, but there's other times when it's so thick on this is what's behind it all, and here's all the words you should be using, and this is the brain science behind it. And to me, it's like you need to have, you guys need to have that background and be able to talk that language, but that's not the level that you deliver at.
Right.
And if people are curious, they can follow that. And the other problem I see is that there's a lot of services like this out there that all they're doing, they haven't thought through the way you guys have about why this stuff works. And all they're doing is, here's a games book, here's all these activities, and even here's a schedule, here's a sequence, all that. But when you start asking them, well, why does it work? Why do we sequence it that way? Why would I use this question over this question? Well, this is just an option that you have. We're providing you options. And to me, it's finding that sweet spot. I think it was Einstein said, make it as simple as possible and no simpler. And he wasn't talking about like complexity. He was talking about people that were dumbing it down too much. And I just see that so often, especially with really quality experiential educators that want to jump into where they see the money is, or they see there's opportunities. They want to steal from Peter to pay Paul, and they really don't understand. They've dumbed down. They've been too simple for what they want to deliver.
Sure. And we talk all the time about meeting our participants where we're at. And the whole point of the platform is to just meet the educator where they're at. But there's no Kikori police. Either use the calendar or don't. Use the reflection questions or don't. Like, nobody is there saying you're doing it wrong. But the thing that I've seen in a lot of different curriculum offerings is that they make it look very linear. And it's this one-way street, and you finish this lesson and then you move on to the next one, and you can't do this lesson down here until you've completed these 4. But team development isn't that way. I mean, and with the search and filter features of the platform, there's so much that you can find, and it's not like you unlock a lesson after you've completed this other one.
It's not gamification, even though it's games.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So I'd like to, for another conversation, I have a whole approach to program design called nonlinear program design. Which allows participants, it takes more preparation, but you can use whatever program you do in multiple different contexts. Another conversation for another time. I want to do a couple of things before we wrap this up. Absolutely. And just some quick questions. Again, with these questions, you're not like signing a contract to your answer. It's what you're thinking right now. So kind of a lightning round. I want to know, what is your favorite book to give? What's the last book that you gave somebody?
Burnout. It is, it's by these two sisters, and I'm looking it up real quick.
Emily and Amelia.
Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna put it up on the screen real quick.
I loved this book. It talks about the stress cycle and how your body has to complete these cycles. And how exercise is really good for you, crying, sleep. But it really kind of spoke to a lot of me as a woman, as an entrepreneur, as trying to balance being a mom and a business owner and a contributing member of society and a den mother and all these different things, but how to balance all that stuff, but how to take care of myself from a physical and a neurological perspective.
Yeah, I think it probably finds its roots in this book, was written in the early 70s, called Overload, where it's totally about the psychology of, they would call it burnout, but he calls it overload back then. Interesting. Okay, so next one. Tell me about one of your heroes. First hero that comes to mind.
My Auntie Vi. My Auntie Vi is 97 years young. She lived independently until about 6 months ago, was still driving and had her own residence. And she is just a pinnacle of optimism and strength and resilience. She helped raise me and my brother when we were young and has outlived her husband and all three of her children. And she's just the most kind and incredible and tenacious woman I've ever met.
Cool. Last one here.
All right.
Favorite quote. What do you find, who or what do you find yourself quoting? Could be a book, a person, author, movie.
Well, I mean, John Dewey, the reflection one a lot, but probably what makes its way into my vernacular on a daily basis is the TV show Friends.
Okay.
I have to ask people all the time if they're a Friends friend, because if you knew all the things that I know, you would think I was very funny. Yeah.
I'm really funny in here. I'm funny.
And so I've stopped prefacing it with oh, this is a quote from Friends, and now I just say it as if I came up with it.
Well, and also it's fine. I remember we used to do that with Fletch. If you remember the Chase movie, it's like, can a day go by without you quoting Fletch or Friends? Now it's Friends, which is quoted all the time. Doesn't matter if they get it. Yeah. It's in here. It's in here. I find myself when I'm doing presentations, especially when I'm working with kids, I'll say stuff that is just funny to me, and I'll keep the straight face, but inside I'm riot laughter.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I crack myself up all the time.
So how can people find out more about what you're doing, who you are, what you do? How can people reach you?
Yeah, so I am on all the socials, and I'm still learning how to use them codependently, maybe. But LinkedIn, Bryn Lottig, I think it's BM Lottig on all of them, except for my Instagram. My Instagram is a lot of my cold plunging, which is Blue Angel 276. 276 was the last numbers of the call sign of my favorite airplane. And then at Kikori app. So KIKORIAPP. And the at Kikori app is streamlined across everything. And we've got a new gal who's doing our TikToks, and she is killing it. So I would love for some of these socials to blow up. So the Facebook.
So you heard it. Go and comment, follow, do all the things you're supposed to do. It sounds like especially on TikTok and Instagram and those types of things. So, hey,
Mhm.
Bryn, thank you for being here. Love this conversation. And I'm excited to see what other hats you discover, because it's always fun to find out cool people are doing cool things, that you are truly living juicy through all this kind of stuff. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, John.